things, if I may, just before we introduce our first speaker. We are, I mean, this, for those who weren't here this morning, this is our first online conference, and we're sort of finding our feet and finding our way within this one, but we've worked amazingly hard and it's done really, really well this morning. So we're on Microsoft Teams. I could ask you, please, if I may, to keep your cameras off and your audio off as well when the speakers are talking. We don't have a chat facility at the moment for that, so if you would save your wonderful questions or comments up to the end of the speaker, and he or she will invite you in to ask those comments. We really welcome that discussion at the end as well. So please, you know, be as interactive as we possibly can with this one. We will record the sessions, and those recordings will be available very soon as well. Our speakers are very ably supported today on the IT front, and throughout by Ben Samuels, who's given us his expertise in the IT world, which is fabulously appreciated, Ben. And also today and this afternoon for both speakers, we have our buddies who are helping to accommodate our speakers and accommodate the proceedings for this afternoon. So Pinky James is our vice chair from NaPTEC, who will be supporting this afternoon. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our first afternoon speaker, who is an esteemed colleague at NaPTEC, Dr. Deborah Pope, currently at Chester. And I noticed from your biopic, Deborah, you've worked in a number of institutions as well, but primarily you started as a primary teacher and leader with expertise and experience in schools in the Wirral, Northwest, and Liverpool as well. So that's quite a range of schools and geographical area to teach in as well. You are a member of the NaPTEC committee, and very valuable one too, and a founding member of the Chartered College of Teaching. Deborah is a very active researcher and lots of expertise and lots of areas to do with teachers, mentors, the primary curriculum as well, and publishing extensively in those particular areas, with lots of very current research that we're dying to hear this afternoon. So without further ado, I'm going to switch off my camera and audio in a second, and I'll invite you to sit back and listen to Deborah's expertise. Deborah, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I will just try and get my PowerPoint on the screen, so if you can let me know when you can see it, that would be great. Is it there?
Spot on.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. First hurdle over.
Indeed.
But you give me quite a build up there, Jonathan, so I'll try and respond to
All
it.
true.
So yeah, a real pleasure to be here this afternoon to talk to everybody for our conference entitled The Challenges for the Current Decade. And I don't know about anybody else, but at the moment it feels like I'm just dealing with the challenges for the next week. But it's really good to be thinking about challenges beyond that too. So great to follow Samantha Twistleton from this morning, because actually some of the themes that she was picking up and some of the research she was referring to is actually echoed in some of the things that I'm going to talk about this afternoon too. So it was really good coincidence really that she did that. So I'm going to talk about reorientating subject knowledge in primary ITE. Not rethinking it, not coming at it completely fresh. We know a lot about subject knowledge in primary, but I do believe it's worth a rethink and a reorientation of how we're approaching it. And at the moment, we have lots of rhetoric about reimagining our system, including ITE, down to our current circumstances, and we're all responding as agilely as we can to things. And we're offering trainees to schools as part of the solution for the current situation. But I think, as James alluded to this morning, there are some challenges within this. And of course, for school mentors, trainee teachers are another responsibility. Could be a very welcome responsibility, but they are yet another responsibility in quite difficult times. So we're all trying to think about how we can help. And in many cases, I'm hearing about programs stripping back unnecessary elements, trying to streamline partnership documentation as much as possible. But of course, within this, we have to be really careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, that all of our time in partnership has to be really purposeful. Even in times of uncertainty, what we do needs to be purposeful. And in many respects, time with mentors that our trainees have is going to be under more pressure. It needs to be more purposeful than usual. And the trainees have got to have maximum impact in schools for themselves as learners, but also for the pupils. We're hearing lots of rhetoric around gap-filling narratives about recovery curricula and so on. And our trainees are going to be part of that landscape. And in many respects, their subject knowledge, and their rapidly developing subject knowledge, is potentially going to be tested more than usual. And of course, all of these other areas, such as relationships and health and safety and everybody's well-being, are of huge importance. I'm not intending to detract from any of that in any way, but just want to shine a little spotlight onto the role of subject knowledge and how we think about it and how people respond to it in the context of partnership. And so is it even relevant to be talking about it now, talking about subject knowledge? I would say it's more relevant than ever for all of those reasons. And what I'm going to do today is to focus on quite a large research project which looked at subject knowledge specifically in primary ITE. And I'm going to pull on a particular strand of that, which is to do with school-based mentors and subject knowledge for primary trainees. So just a little bit of background. As you'll all be aware, I don't need to tell you that secure subject knowledge has been a feature of successive versions of the professional standards. Samantha Twistleton was talking this morning about the Carter review of ITT, and within that, subject knowledge is given quite a prominent focus. And there's this rather marvellous statement in there about all ITE partnerships should rigorously audit, track and systematically improve trainees' subject knowledge throughout the programme. And I think one thing to think about here is how challenging that actually is in primary. And of course, in the Carter review, there's no distinction made between the expectations for primary and secondary teaching, except to acknowledge the challenge of breadth for primary teachers. So the responsibility, I think, as Sam was talking about this morning, really sits with providers largely and with partnerships as to how they interpret those requirements for primary ITE. And it's not simple, because as Robin Alexander reminded us at the time of the Cambridge Primary Review, there is a lack of a coherence to the discourse about subject knowledge in teacher education as a whole in England in comparison with some other European jurisdictions. So it does lead to this question about how is subject knowledge for primary ITE framed within our partnerships? And is our intent realised in the interpretation of it within dynamic settings in partnership? So knowledge for teaching, much of the interest for that stemmed from Schulman's seminal work, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, where he defined these 7 knowledge bases for teaching, including pedagogical content knowledge, which he referred to as representing subject matter for teaching. So there is a distinction between subject knowledge for passing a GCSE exam in a subject and subject matter for teaching. And he described it as this distinct phenomenon representing this special amalgam of content and pedagogy that is uniquely the providence of teachers. So really important. And of course, from there have been many developments. New knowledge bases have been identified and there's been extended and added to. Pedagogical content knowledge is a widely debated phenomenon. It's been re-examined and reanalyzed in many, many different ways, but it remains a very useful concept for us to think about in relation to subject knowledge. And there have been many models of knowledge bases for teaching that take into account things like dynamic contexts of partnership. So there's a rich background. So drawing on that, what am I talking about when I'm saying subject knowledge for teaching? We have content knowledge, and this is the bit that most people immediately think about, sometimes referred to as subject matter knowledge. And I think the first part of it, the substantive knowledge, is the bit that is immediately recognisable, but it's more than facts, it's concepts, it's key ideas, it's principles, and it's also how they are connected. And we're realising more and more how important that element is. I think Sam said this morning, it's not how much you know, it's how it's organised in your thinking. But also there is this element of syntactic knowledge, which in recent times seems to be being referred to as disciplinary knowledge. That's how ideas are generated, how they gain acceptance, how they become established within particular disciplines, the debates within disciplines and the working practices of disciplines, also part of content knowledge. And of course, this presents some challenges for primary ITE, because with the best will in the world, that with the range of subjects we teach in the curriculum, no primary trainee is ever going to have that disciplinary knowledge for all of the subjects that they're teaching. And so that's something we have to come at a little bit differently in primary teacher education. We then also have pedagogical content knowledge, which is about the representations of the subject matter. How do we make it meaningful and accessible to the learners we're teaching? So all of those things, the analogies we draw on, the illustrations, the explanations, the demonstrations, and how to make effective connections between ideas for learners. And also subject-specific pedagogical research. So what do we know about subject-specific teaching approaches, how children think about particular ideas, their preconceptions, their misconceptions, and importantly for trainees, anticipating complexity of ideas. And those two really work very closely together. In some ways, it's difficult to separate them in the act of teaching. So really, really important that we think about all of these elements. And also some aspects, some very subject-specific aspects of curriculum knowledge can be thought of as part of subject knowledge. So specific curricula, but also the teaching materials and resources. So if somebody's teaching evaporation in primary science, yes, they need to know which analogies, which illustrations, which examples, but also what kinds of resources can be very useful here to bring this to life. And also lateral and vertical curriculum knowledge, very much a focus at the moment of thinking about what's happening in a subject-specific way within a year group's curricula, and then vertical knowledge between year groups in the curriculum, what comes before, what comes after, that effective sequencing. And the key thing about this, obviously, in terms of subject knowledge, is these are all bound by the subject. We are not talking here, for example, pedagogical content knowledge is subject specific. That's distinct from general pedagogical knowledge, which of course is not bound by any subject. We're talking there about classroom management, behaviour management, general ways of using questioning, explanations, demonstrations, and so on. All of those skills that teachers draw on all of the time, but in a generic way. Pedagogical content knowledge is that very subject-specific element of pedagogy. It is sometimes referred to as pedagogical subject knowledge, and that's very prevalent in maths education literature. So I've mentioned one of the challenges in there for primary subject knowledge. We have the breadth. We also have the fact that primary trainees don't have those disciplinary backgrounds in many of the subjects they're teaching, and coverage across primary ITE programs. Sam was talking about this morning. The choices we make, we cannot possibly ever in a primary program cover every subject in the curriculum in the depth that we would want to. So we have to make some choices. And so those key ideas and key principles that we introduce trainees to have to be extended when they're encountered in practice. And so it introduces this element of very individualised learning, which of course, when we start to bring in individuals' conceptions about subject knowledge, can start to take things in a very particular direction for each individual. We also know that some forms of knowledge can only be developed through practice. And so those connections to school experiences are essential. But again, they're highly contextualised. Every school setting tells a different story. Sometimes the subject knowledge is very embedded in very particular ways of teaching subjects. in particular schemes and resources that provide excellent learning, but again, it becomes very individualised to the context and to the individual trainee teacher. So why does this matter? Why am I talking about subject knowledge for primary teaching? Well, we know that having a body of specialised knowledge is very tightly bound to any claim of professional status. And generalist teaching skills can go a very long way, but can limit potential. And this is where there's lots of links to what Sam was talking to about this morning. That when we get into ideas such as effective curriculum sequencing, modelling, explanations, and in summary, that in-the-moment responsive teaching that Toshan and Mumby talk about, that synchronic time epistemology, they call it, where in a moment of teaching, the teacher is drawing on so many different knowledge bases that actually having that very good base of subject knowledge in terms of particularly pedagogical content knowledge, how we bring that subject matter to life, how we make it meaningful, how we make it accessible, is tremendously important. And then again, looking at the features of expert and non-expert teachers, Berliner summarises some of this research, and one of the features that distinguished most between an expert and a non-expert teacher was the teacher's ability for deep representations of the subject matter. And of course, that links very, very closely to pedagogical content knowledge, that aspect of subject knowledge. And in fact, in that research, they showed that these features had most impact on younger children. So we're not talking about A-level and sixth form, we're talking about young children in primary schools where this had the most difference. So it is important and it does matter, and we've got those close links with PCK. So what I'm going to unpick a little bit is the findings from one strand of quite a large research study that looked at conceptions of subject knowledge in primary ITT from the perspectives of student teachers and teacher educators, whether they were teacher educators who were based in universities full-time or whether they were school-based mentors. All were included in the research. And the research took a bricolage approach, which uses this metaphor of the researcher stitching together a patchwork quilt. So it's a pieced together set of representations that are fitted to the specifics of a complex situation. So the researcher is the bricoleur, the person fashioning this patchwork quilt. And it takes shape using various methods and tools and techniques and sources of data and so on, and brings them back together into a reconceived interpretation. In terms of sampling, where did the research take place? The research took place across 2 post-92 university providers, and it focused on undergraduate primary trainees. And they were interviewed in quite an in-depth way right at the end of their training. So they'd finished their final placements, they had done all of their assignments, they were ready to qualify. Also school mentors drawn from both of the partnerships and university tutors who worked on the programmes. And just to give you an idea of scale, there were about 200 participants, and I also analysed about 500 documents, and you'll see some of the findings from that I'll come on to in a moment. So data collection methods, mostly qualitative, semi-structured questionnaires, semi-structured interviews, group interviews, and content analysis of relevant documents. And they were analysed using a constructivist grounded theory approach, so very inductive. The findings very much emerged from the data rather than me imposing something onto the data. So just to orientate you to some of the key findings from the wider study that have relevance to more of the detail I'm going to look at, what I found from this was, in essence, there was no shared understanding of subject knowledge for teaching as a critically distinct concept. Instead, it seemed to be used as an umbrella term which represented general teacher knowledge. And then associated with that, there were sort of multiple interpretations of what individuals included within that umbrella term. But despite the variability, there was some consensus around the inclusion of some aspects of content knowledge, mostly substantive knowledge, and aspects of curriculum knowledge. And they were very much linked to narrow ideas about curriculum delivery. So thinking about the research that Sam was talking about this morning, which is something I was very familiar with and has had a big impact on me in my work as a teacher educator, you could very much see the task managers and the curriculum deliverers in these conceptions of subject knowledge. And those ideas were mostly talked about in association with general pedagogical knowledge, general teaching skills and approaches. There was very little attention given to subject-specific pedagogy. And it's interesting that those individuals who thought at the conceptual level, they're the ones who did make reference to pedagogical content knowledge. So that idea of the concept skill builders applied equally in this research. It was very, very clear. So just thinking about these narrow conceptions of subject knowledge, they were especially prevalent in the school-based mentors who participated in the research. And I'm going to pick up that strand now. And it was interesting because within the mentors' narratives, there was virtually no reference to any aspects of anything that could be considered to be pedagogical content knowledge, which I found quite surprising and a little bit troubling, as I'll also talk about as we move through. So what were student teachers' perceptions about mentors and subject knowledge? These are just some key highlights. From their perspective, they thought that subject knowledge was not a key concern of school-based mentors, and they felt the focus was very much on generic pedagogy. And interestingly, they felt that as they'd moved through their undergraduate programme, that the focus had moved away from subject knowledge in first year and had actually moved in their final placement very much towards generic pedagogy. They also felt that the responsibility for subject knowledge sat with the individual trainee. They rarely thought that it developed through co-construction with a school-based mentor. And where they could recall those episodes, it was very much about the interests of the mentor. So if they were placed with a mentor who was an English leader in the school, they would have some input on English subject knowledge. One talked about being placed with a mentor who was particularly enthusiastic about art, and they felt that their subject knowledge had developed through working with them. But where school mentors did comment on subject-specific knowledge, invariably it seemed to be in the form of flagging up a deficit for the student to go away and sort out. And that phrase "go away" I've highlighted because it was a recurrent theme in the data. It emerged as its own code in the data from both the student teachers, but also the school mentors. And it was really quite an interesting finding in the research. And we'll return to that. Mentors' perceptions. So from their point of view, who did they perceive was responsible for subject knowledge and trainee subject knowledge development? And one mentor here had some really clear ideas. You know, we can't deal with subject-based as well as effective ways of teaching and assessing. I'd like to see university on the subject knowledge. You take that mantle and we write, you know, we take, what do you do with that? Another mentor was a little bit unsure at being asked the question. I think probably school more with delivery. I may be wrong. I thought my part was more delivery and trying to expose them to different areas of the school. And another mentor was quite pragmatic. I think my responsibility to them is to give them the plans if we've got them. So even where there was a notion of working in partnership, of this actually being sort of partly the responsibility of the university and the schools, the data still suggested this fairly hands-off approach. So if a school highlights a gap, then you, the university, would identify it and fill that gap, or be able to give access to something to help them with whatever area they need to access. And another mentor said, I think the school-based mentor role there is to flag up and say, do you think you need to do some work? And communicate that to the university person so that somebody's aware. And this really supports the feelings that the trainees had, that they were very much left to work it out for themselves, and it was a personal responsibility and not a concern for the mentors. And it does raise some questions there about the efficiency of waiting for a visit from a university linked tutor to report some sort of deficit in subject knowledge. And it was interesting that some of the mentors actually seemed to be surprised to even be asked about subject knowledge development of trainees. I think many of them actually said they hadn't really thought about it before. And then returning to this recurring phrase, this go away phrase that kept coming up, it appeared in the mentors' perspectives as well. The students themselves, they've got to go away and look what the content is and research it, and to make sure they're really familiar with it, as opposed to school-based learning is more about them pulling it all together. And another said they've got to work, go away and do it themselves. They've got to do it. You can only point them in the right direction. And what was interesting here in doing the interviews is that every time this phrase go away was mentioned in whatever context, it was generally accompanied by this gesture of an outward facing palm. You need to go away and do that. Go away and think about it. And that can be interpreted in a number of ways, really. Hence my question, is it dismissal or is it self-protection? I think the trainees were viewing it as dismissal. Go away and you work on that. When I was interviewing the mentors, that is not what I was picking up from them. What I was picking up was okay, here's my boundary. I can't take this on as well. Here's my personal space. I'm putting some sort of brakes on this here. I can't take this on as well. And I think one of the mentors summarised this, I felt, really insightfully in terms of the factors that impact on opportunities for subject knowledge development, which of course it's a lot to ask one mentor to work on the entire primary curriculum, and we need other approaches. And they summed it up really nicely here, I felt. I think it varies widely from school to school, depending on the quality of mentoring, time provided by mentors to actually get to know their students and devise a personalised programme for them, quality and availability of subject specialists in agreeing to be observed or meet with students. Time is at such a premium for teachers that it can be hard to engage somebody who does not have direct involvement with the students, as they have so many other demands on their time and energy. And I think what I took from that mentor is that they were seriously committed to mentoring, and they did an excellent job, by the way, but actually it can be quite a lone activity, and they're looking for involvement from other people in the school, but also very, very much aware of the individual pressures that other members of staff are under, and reluctant to ask them to do more when they know that they could actually be just putting them under too much pressure. And I found that was really interesting, and I felt it summed up the situation quite nicely. There were some assumptions evident that echoed some of the student teachers' feelings. Some mentors assume that student teachers arrive on their school placement fully equipped with all the subject-specific knowledge that they would ever require on that placement, and they were just providing the opportunity to put that into practice. And there was a general reluctance to take responsibility for subject-specific training. And there was an underlying theme there of subject knowledge being located with the university and with the individual student teacher. Now, I think it's really important at this point to just place a reminder here that this research was just asking these mentors about subject knowledge and subject knowledge development with their trainees. It was not about mentoring in the fuller context of the role. And these were all very successful mentors who had volunteered their time to participate in the study. And these comments were just in relation to subject knowledge development. And they were uncomfortable findings, because I have to say here, we know that school-based mentors are essential to ITE, and they do a fabulous job. And the partnerships that were involved in this research were not struggling partnerships. They were thriving, outstanding primary partnerships. And we value immensely the work that these mentors do. And so those findings were a little bit uncomfortable, certainly. And they echoed findings that Edwards and Ogden shared 20 years ago about the lack of focus on subject-specific knowledge in primary mentoring. And they did caution that we shouldn't be taking primary teachers' subject matter knowledge for granted. And this was making me think, well, has nothing changed? All the mentors in the study identified that challenge of time. They were happy with the paperwork, but there was uncertainty about how to complete it. And this really got me thinking, and this quote, I'm not going to read it all out, but I happen to be reading this from Johnny Saldana about thinking qualitatively and about the ethics of this. I felt quite conflicted that I'm a practicing member of the teacher education sector. These people had given me their time and made themselves very vulnerable for me in sharing this. And I felt, what am I going to do with it? I don't really want to share research findings that don't necessarily paint a particularly good picture of mentoring. This quote really summed it up for me about what participants in research give you in data. You don't collect data, they give you this data as a gift. And they're giving you their time, their knowledge, their experience, their insight. And it's there so that we can learn from them, not about them. And that was really, really important to me as a researcher. What can I learn from them? And what I noticed was in the interviews, there were some recurring phrases that were clearly identifiable from the teacher's standards. So teacher standard 3 about subject knowledge, but also the specific assessment descriptors that were used by both partnerships that were used for grading trainees. I'm sure most institutions will have something similar. And the amount of cross-referencing between these documents in the interviews suggested to me that this needed looking at. And so in response to that, the key drivers that the mentors were mentioning all the time were the teacher standards, the lesson observation, analysis, feedback forms and the prompts on them, and these assessment descriptors against the teacher standards. And the intertextuality, the way that they referred to each other all the time between these 3 types of documents resembled Atkinson's and Coffey's observation that in literate bureaucratized settings in particular, one may identify a semi-autonomous domain of text and documents that refer primarily to another. And this is definitely what was happening. In this sense, the documents seem to have developed some sort of agency that perhaps is never really intended when they were created. And if we look at teacher standard 3, you'll all be really familiar with this. Content analysis of this shows you that it's not just about substantive knowledge and factual elements of substantive knowledge. When you look in bullet point 1, it's very clear that pedagogical content knowledge is going to be required in order to bring that subject matter to life in meaningful and accessible ways for pupils, and in order to identify their misunderstandings and misconceptions and know how to address them. And when we look at the second bullet point, this really speaks to that syntactic knowledge, that the disciplinary knowledge of understanding what's current, the debates within subjects, within disciplinary areas, and the value of scholarship, of learning about those things. And if we look at the others, we've got definite elements here of subject-specific pedagogy. So again, pedagogical content knowledge. So it is quite multifaceted. You can analyse it in that way. But of course, that relies on you having that understanding in the first place and viewing it in that way in the first place. It is open to a more generic interpretation. And again, looking at the assessment descriptors that were used in both the ITE partnerships, they'd originally been developed by a working group of providers in the Northwest when the new teacher standards were introduced. And the majority of school-based mentors, that they expressed some uncertainty about completing the documentation, mostly in terms of worrying that they needed to be consistent with other mentors in other schools. And they were saying that mentor training was very helpful, but it's hard to retain when you're back in the moment with a trainee filling in a form. And they noted that these assessment descriptors were incredibly useful support. And they did say that they relied on them, not just for grading, but when they were completing lesson observations and when they were filling in report forms at the end of the placements, and really generally in their conversations with the trainees in target setting and so on. They found them very, very reassuring. They found them very time-saving. And here's just to give you a flavour, I'm sure you're familiar with these sorts of documents. Here's just an extract from Standard 3. And really, there's not a great deal of difference from the standard. It's just demonstrating different levels. So we've got a developing understanding, an appropriate subject knowledge, competent level of subject knowledge, highly confident and competent level. And then the same sort of thing in relation to fostering and maintaining pupils' interest. And the second bullet point, similarly, is developing understanding and shows some awareness of developments. Demonstrates awareness, promotes scholarship, demonstrates good awareness and promotes scholarship to all pupils, demonstrates a high level of awareness, promotes high levels of scholarship. So these documents were only ever really intended to scaffold that process of how do we show some distinction when we are assessing against the standards. They were never intended to be used as prompts to be referred to when analysing lesson observations. And to summarise, content analysis of these documents showed that the wording of the descriptors was orientated entirely towards some narrow elements of content knowledge and general pedagogical knowledge. The wording was not orientated towards subject-specific pedagogical content knowledge. And that pattern mirrored exactly the consensus in the findings about how the participants were conceptualising subject knowledge. Of course, we cannot suggest there's a causal link between the documents and the findings, but there is definitely a correlation between the orientation of the wording in the documents and the orientation of mentors' thinking about subject knowledge. And so given that these documents were continually being cross-referenced in relation to framing thinking about subject knowledge in these mentoring interactions, might they be encouraging a very particular view that could be quite reductionist or simplistic view of subject knowledge? And these documents appear to have an agency that was never intended. And just as a matter of interest, when the teacher standards, the new teacher standards were introduced, there was another set of descriptors produced by NASBET and USET that were not used in these partnerships, but I did analyse them as a contrast as part of the research. And it was very interesting that they are worded in a way that is orientated towards both pedagogical content knowledge and a much fuller concept of content knowledge. So it's just interesting to look at the difference between them. And then looking at lesson observation feedback on subject knowledge, I analysed all of the lesson observations that were offered by the third years who were participants in the study, the cohorts who were who were participating in the research, that were offered as good evidence of subject knowledge for Standard 3. So 427 observations were analysed, and these are just the highlights. There's a lot more in-depth comments that will be published shortly, but generic comments made up about 72% of the text that was recorded specifically in relation to, in a box that was specifically for Teacher Standard 3 subject knowledge. So 72% were completely generic. Only 5% had a wholly subject-specific comment in there. And some key points about the content of the feedback in those comments. So more than half of text in those comments referred to general pedagogical knowledge, and was almost all of it was purely general. And this is commenting about subject knowledge. Only 9% of the text referred to aspects of pedagogical content knowledge, which is surprising because if you're watching a lesson in action and you're seeing subject matter being turned into a teachable form for learners, and you're analysing the subject knowledge that's evidenced in that lesson, one might think that that would play a bigger part. But there was also a distinct group of comments that emerged that indicated a comparative scale of level of subject knowledge. So good subject knowledge, secure subject knowledge, sound subject knowledge, some weaknesses in subject knowledge. And this was actually the third most common category of comment in that section. And of course, going back to those descriptors, mirrored exactly the wording in those descriptors. Another category emerged that repeated back the phrasing of parts of Teacher Standard 3. You know, these wonderfully natural comments of you fostered and maintained pupils' interest, you promoted scholarship. So it's clear where they're coming from. And in fact, 45 of the lesson observations from the paperwork, it would have been impossible to distinguish which subject was actually the focus of the observation. And again, I have to keep saying this, these were thriving partnerships that are outstanding. We're just talking about that very subject-specific feedback in relation to Teacher Standard 3. And here's a little gem just to show the difference. So within all of these lesson observations, I came across this comment in the S3 prompt box, where we've got subject-specific knowledge and pedagogy combined into extremely high-quality feedback. When teaching children about 3D shapes, the most effective way to do this is for them to see and handle 3D shapes. During your initial carpet time, you relied on the use of images on the interactive whiteboard and looked at 3D shapes as 2D images. Can make it difficult when children are trying to visualise hidden sides or corners. And also take care about your questions, make sure they're not misleading, and it goes on, and you can read that for yourselves. And it's really clear how that feedback, the impact that could have on making a trainee's teaching far more effective and knowing how to improve it than a statement like make the I can statement child friendly, or you kept them on the carpet for too long. This is where the real learning is going to take place in relation to subject knowledge. So brilliant bit of feedback. I don't think I ever have time to write such an eloquent comment, but it does exist. And then just a little point about roles in this. That school mentors had very accurate perceptions of the role of the university link tutors. They knew it was a quality assurance role, and they were quite happy with that. They were perfectly content. But in contrast, when the university tutor participants were asked about their roles when they were doing school visits, they were much less sure about the purpose of their role and exactly what they were expected to do. And there was a collective complaint, which is about unrealistic amounts of administrative work to complete on each visit. And what was interesting there was this collective sense of deprofessionalisation from primary university tutors, who all had been recruited to teacher education to provide subject expertise, but actually in relation to partnership, they were performing mostly administrative roles. And that's just something to think about in light of the findings. So do we have a clearly articulated view of subject knowledge for primary teaching? Well, none of the mentors could articulate precisely how the institutions intended to portray subject knowledge for primary teaching. None of them believed they had a clear view of the prevailing ethos. They talked about it being important, but in terms of what it is and how it needs to be thought about in terms of training, not so sure. And one mentor actually asked quite anxiously, should there be one? And another mentor slightly defensively said, well, I assume that my interpretation is fine because no one's ever mentioned it when they've been out. And I think this raises some really interesting questions for us about how explicitly do we articulate the complexity of such elements in our partnerships. And is that role around relationship management and lots of admin work, are we neglecting some of these important details? And I wrote down something that Sam said this morning. There's a danger that the routine becomes an end in itself. And I think that's really something quite useful to reflect on. So the implications of this, well, the findings suggested that these partnership documents had developed a sort of agency of their own, and it was useful to look at how documents can drive and fashion these episodes of human interaction. And in many respects, we could call them the artifacts of practice. And they do just reflect the system and its levers of power and control. So teachers are very used to working within these sorts of systems. And so are we in teacher education. And do we become so complicit with it that we actually just start to follow things quite blindly without really interrogating more closely? Back to that idea of curriculum deliverers, really. And it suggests that we need to remember to consider these complexities, such as epistemological orientation of documents, so the way they present things like how we think about knowledge, when they're intended for use in collective practice in dynamic contexts, because they will be interpreted in lots of different ways. And it raises more questions. So are some documents and processes actually a distraction from high quality mentoring and coaching? How might we resolve some of these tensions between needing to have consistency of practice for obvious reasons and enabling professional autonomy? And how do ITE partnerships articulate complexity? How might we empower teacher educators to utilise their considerable collective expertise in this endeavour? And so just to finish off, so why now in the current context? We have a new Ofsted inspection framework for schools and ITT. We have an ITT core content framework. And both of those flesh out quite a lot of detail in terms of subject specificity. And the core content framework does flesh out in particular ideas about subject knowledge. Again, taking on board what Sam said about we need to look at this critically and use it critically. But there is a definite focus in there on subject specificity. Partnerships are looking to embed these successfully. So if mentoring in primary is sort of in more of the generic territory, successful but generic, what work have we got to do to enhance that subject specificity in order to do that successfully? And of course, the current challenges, I couldn't speak today without mentioning them, challenges of the pandemic. We are looking at reduced opportunities for trainees to move around schools, to go and observe other teachers who might be subject experts in different areas of the curriculum. So we need some creative responses. And in this process of streamlining documentation and processes, I think it just illustrates we need to be careful. There does need to be some caution here that we don't inadvertently create other problems further down the line. And so I think there are opportunities here to begin to reorientate this narrative of subject knowledge for primary teaching within this landscape. And I've shared these research findings today as a provocation for thinking and further discussion. So thank you.
Wow, that was amazing, Deborah. Thank you so much for that. My goodness, you've really given us a provocation there to as well. And my goodness, you've practically rewritten the title, I think, because it is about, yes, the challenges, but you've pointed us to ways forward to circumvent some of those obstacles and challenges which are there from it as well. And I really like the ownership. And I'm not going to talk anymore because it's not my position. I want to throw it open to questions, and I see Ashley's hand is straight up there as well. So thank you, Deborah. I'll just give you a chance to grab a drink there while we offer Ashley the opportunity to ask the question. Ashley, please.
Not so much a question as sharing experience, because as a maths group team at our place, some years ago we looked at mentor feedback and found the same thing, that there was no sense it was a maths lesson in the majority of cases. So we devised a subject-specific observation sheet that included different aspects of maths pedagogical content knowledge, and they had to fill in the form, and it forced them to think about the maths aspects, and that really increased them then commenting on maths aspects in their free feedback. And we've since gone on to introduce that in several other subjects as well. So we had noticed that the forums influenced what they did, so we tried to use that strategically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, I've been involved in similar initiatives in the past as well. But of Of course, this is my caution about that creates more paperwork, doesn't it? That's more, not less. And that's my point, that when we try and streamline things for primary, there is that real risk that we lose that specificity. So I love what you're doing, and I'd be very interested in what you found from it. But yes, and it is that trade-off, and where's the balance point? Because we've got very busy mentors, we've got very busy teacher education departments. How do we do it without it becoming more of an imposition on time? And I think there are lots of things to discuss in there. But yes, I think you've illustrated that perfectly. Thank you.
That's a super question, Ashley. Thank you very much for that one as well. Other questions, colleagues, on that one? Gosh, that's a really good idea. And actually, Ashley, just to respond to that as well, what a great idea, because you're right, the documentation can be so generic and so woolly and so unhelpful that actually the whole enterprise is meaningless as well. However, as Deborah quite says, we don't want to reinvent and give ourselves another set of documents to fill in during that observation as well. But yeah, certainly something to think about there as well. I wonder if Pinky, perhaps. May I just bring Pinky in, who's supporting you on this one? Just your thoughts, perhaps, on this one, Pinky. I know you've got your math hat on as well.
Yes. I mean, I think what's been really interesting is that it's timely, that I think, for us to revisit that real challenge in primary of making them experts across 13 subjects, and how do we manage that? And especially now with the core curriculum content coming in as well on top of that, you raised some really interesting points. And you know, we've gone down the route of doing a booklet of prompts per subject. So alongside the generic form, you've got a booklet of prompts that will allow you, because of course that we don't expect our trainees to be experts, but then also we have to be experts in all those subject knowledge too, to be able to comment, you know, specifically on geography or phonics or whatever. So I think it goes both ways, and I think your research really begins for me to start thinking and crystallizing again and revisit again that real challenge and balancing act that we all have to go down. Maybe when all of this sort of pandemic has calmed down, it's another opportunity to go back and think, actually, how might we assess, and maybe with no observations in school, how do we then challenge the subject knowledge of each trainee? You know, it's that they learn something in university, they practice it in school. How do we connect the triangle together? So I think so. Thank you for kind of reigniting some of those thoughts.
Yeah, and I like that idea of the booklet, because if these documents do become the mediating artifacts of partnership, which I think they do really, don't they? That we have to make sure that the prompts that they are using are useful and are going to reach those ends that we need in primary. That so I like the idea of booklet, and Ashley's idea as well. I think they're all really good ideas. That the generic prompts are not going to be enough to get the kind of quality interactions, and also to make mentors realise that subject knowledge development kind of is their responsibility as well, because they're the ones in the moment, and that's a very difficult thing to add to their existing workload. These mentors were doing a fabulous job with the trainees, but it just wasn't that subject specific element that was perhaps not as outstanding as some of the other elements. And I think it's an ongoing challenge for primary, because of course we fit into a system that is generic teacher education. We tend to use the same documentation across programs, and it doesn't always fit, and we don't want a proliferation of so many different versions of things, but at the same time we need enough distinction that acknowledges those very specific challenges within it. There's a lot to think about it.
There is, yeah, absolutely. But I think you're right that mentors are already doing an amazing job, and one of the challenges is how then to kind of encourage them to add that extra required layer, really. But I think it is important, absolutely.
Super question. Thank you, Deborah, for that answer. Lovely. I've got time for two more questions. Darnell had her hand up. Would you like to ask your question, please? Thank you.
Yeah, Thank you, Deborah. Really enjoy your talk and your research. I'm thinking in terms of the student, the trainees themselves, and I'm thinking, how do you begin, to address this with them? This idea of, I mean, I'm a specialist, a foreign language specialist. And that's what, I train, my student to teach. And sometimes I do come up against this idea that it is not as important, although they do need to be evaluated and they do need to pass the module.
Yeah, I think, I mean, part of the, I'm getting strange feedback here. Part of the bigger research project did look at students' conceptualisations, and there's a paper that I've written that you might find quite interesting on that. It's in Education 3 to 13, that they held widely varying conceptions of this. And it really echoes what Sam was talking about this morning, about some of them really don't think it's important at all. And then it's our job to really try and do something about that. Some of them have some very narrow views of it, as it's just facts. So in something like languages, they might be saying, oh, well, there's not much subject knowledge in languages because it's just facts. And of course, there's tons of subject knowledge in languages. And in terms of pedagogical content knowledge, how we teach languages is a really diverse area and a very specialist area that lots of teachers, primary teachers, struggle with. There are those students, though, who do think very complexly. They do think conceptually, and they have quite a hard time because of it, because they can see the overwhelming nature of it. And so I would say to you, maybe have a little read of that paper. And another approach is to try and get them to think about this framework of subject knowledge. And in a book that's a spin-off from this research project, it is Understanding Subject Knowledge for Primary Teaching, that there's lots of case studies in there for particular episodes of teaching across the primary curriculum, and it kind of provides a model that you might be able to use of how to make them aware of the knowledge that underpins particular teaching episodes, because some can get very activity focused. They search for activities, that's a great idea, I'll do that, but without really thinking of those complexities that underpin what's involved in that activity. So I don't know if I've answered your question.
No, you absolutely have. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Again, thank you. That's a great question, and what a wonderful reply as well, Deborah, for that. Huge challenges, and I like your idea of being creative responses needed for this one. And already we've heard several today, so that's really excellent. Okay, Deborah, thank you for that. That was marvelous. Thoroughly enjoyed your